Okay, so I've been talking about a couple of things. Go to that next slide there. Over the course of these last few weeks, 4 biblical concepts in regards to how we perceive and understand our giving and our participation in the body of Christ. So we talked a couple of weeks ago about covenant, how God has blessed us, and then the blessing of God demands a response. And so we respond by giving, by sharing, by participating, by following Jesus. It's our response to the way in which God has blessed us. And then last week we talked about the tithe as a plan for giving, or as a guide for giving. And we talked about the tithe in the Old Testament, and today we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in regards to how we practically put that response to God into practice. And then today, I wanted to talk about sacrifice as a posture for giving. We don't often think of sacrifice in a positive way. We oftentimes think of sacrifice in a negative way, but really, biblically, sacrifice has always been a positive thing. And it's been a posture, it is a posture for our giving. So if you go to that next slide, the text that's kind of the basis for today is Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And if you can read that. Yeah, it's a little bit bigger there than it is over here. Let's read it together, shall we? Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Leave that slide up there for a second. There's just a couple of things that I would point out here. One is that it's God's mercy, in view of God's mercy. So that's part of the covenant of God, isn't it? So God is merciful to us, and because God has been merciful to us in Jesus Christ, then we offer ourselves back to Him. And Paul says it's a living sacrifice, that we are living sacrifices. When you sacrifice something, what are you doing? You're giving up. And in the case of the Old Testament law, what are you doing when you make a sacrifice? You're killing it, right? So life is being taken away, generally, when there's a sacrifice. But Paul says here that we are living sacrifices. So that's an interesting flip on words. And that this offering to God of ourselves is a spiritual act of worship. It's a spiritual act of worship. So when we give and when we sacrifice and when we share, one of the things that I don't think we generally get is that our whole lives, everything we do, everything we think, everything that we go about our daily work and business is an offering of worship. A lot of people just think, Sunday morning at 10 o'clock is worship, and then that's that. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying that our whole lives are an act of worship. And so how we talk to people, how we treat people, in this building and at Cub Foods and at Ace Hardware and under the roof of our home, these are all acts of worship. And if we thought about that more regularly, our behavior might change a little bit, because God is aware of all this, isn't He? So it's an act of worship, and then he says, look, 6th line down there, that it's about transformation, that we are transformed when we offer ourselves as an act of sacrifice. So the transformation takes place when we make that decision to say to God, I am all yours, I belong to you. And then the transformation starts, and our thinking changes, and our spirit changes, our lives change. And what ends up happening is that we test and approve God's will. So when we hear something that's God-centered, God-like, godly, we know that, we recognize it. We can see it for what it is, because we're already in that process of being transformed and changed, so that we can say yes to God. And if it's not of God, we can say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't seem like the way in which God would lead us or us or guide us or direct us. You see, that all happens because of us making that commitment to be a living sacrifice in response to God's mercy. Okay, go to the next slide. So, in the Old Testament, sacrifices ended up becoming a form of religion without the relationship of religion. So God established all these sacrifices in the Old Testament. I think you know that. I'm not going to go through them all. But there were sacrifices for sin, sacrifices for Thanksgiving, sacrifices for new crops coming in, sacrifices for relationships to be built, all kinds of sacrifices in the Old Testament. What ended up happening is the people just thought, offering a sheep once a year was good enough, and then I can do whatever I want. Offering a cow once a year was good enough, and then I can do whatever I want. It just became a form of religion. So what happens in the prophets, after Israel had been established for quite a long time, some things like this, 1 Samuel 15:22, let's read that together. To obey is better than sacrifice. How about that? So God is more interested in obedience than the outward acts of religion. Let's read Hosea 6:6. God delights in loyalty rather than sacrifice. Loyalty is another word for faithfulness. Faithfulness, obedience, okay? God delights in faithfulness or loyalty rather than sacrifice. Again, the outward expression or the inward desire. That's what's going on here. And then Proverbs 21:3, let's read it together. Righteousness, justice are more important than sacrifice. So doing the right thing and standing up for justice, standing up against wrong and for good and for right are always better than religious external practice. Okay? So just to get thinking about this for a minute, I mean, today in the life of the church, what are some of those things that could be considered just religious practice with the wrong attitude, right? Communion. Oh, yeah, just come up and do it and not even think about it. Great. What else? Attending Sunday morning worship. Just coming in to get your name checked off because you submit the communication card. Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, somebody knows. I've been here. Check it out. What else? Religious practice. Service. Okay. Just serving sometimes if our heart's not in it and we're just doing it because we think we're going to get some credits with God. Yeah.
Write a check.
What's that?
Writing a check.
Writing a check. Giving. Giving can be a religious practice, can it? If our heart's not in it, if it's just something we're doing, again, to get checks with God. And that's kind of the test. If we're doing all this stuff, just because we think it's going to make us better with God, then we're wrong. You see, because God is more interested in our hearts than He is in our checks. He's more interested in our hearts than He is in our service. He's more interested in our hearts than He is in our participation in worship. But you see, when our hearts are transformed, then all that other stuff is transformed as well. And so we can give with joy. We can serve with joy. We can worship with enthusiasm and excitement. We can be God's people. Right? Okay? Go to the next one. So Jesus continued this thought in the New Testament, and again, there's other passages, but Jesus quotes in Matthew 9:12, He quotes that Old Testament passage from Hosea and says, that God desires mercy more than sacrifice. And this happened after He called Matthew to follow Him, and when the Pharisees saw this, the religious leaders saw this, they asked His disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He was hanging out with the sinners. He was hanging out with the bad people. He was going to the places where a righteous person would not go. And so they said, "What are you doing? What are you doing following this guy?" And Jesus says it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. I think sometimes too often in the church we think we're the righteous ones and everyone else are the sinners. But Jesus kind of turns that on its head and says, look, I mean, if you're just doing your church stuff for your own benefit, you're probably the sinner. If you don't know any sinners, and aren't hanging out with any sinners, you really need to question whether you're right with God or not. In Mark chapter 12, you know this one too, Jesus says to love God and neighbor is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. One of the leaders of the law came to him and asked him which is the greatest of the commandments, and he knew that, love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus said that's more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Amazing, isn't it? Jesus understands that there's a posture that we need to take. And if you look at these stories and look at them in depth, there's a posture of ministry. That when we're following Jesus, we have a posture of looking to the people that are in need and meeting those needs as best we can. There's a posture of hospitality that welcomes all those in. And, regardless of who they are and what they look like and what they've done, a posture of hospitality. I went to a meeting with the bishop yesterday down in Bloomington, and there were probably about, I'd say 150 people there. And we were having some conversation about stuff, and we ended up sitting at tables and answering a bunch of questions. And then the bishop, one of the questions was, what are we missing in our gathering today? And one of the people stood up and said, here's what we're missing. If you look around this group of 150 people, you see almost 99% are over the age of 65. Oh, imagine that. That's true. And then the person said, and if you look around this table, you will see that 100% of the people are white. There was one African-American woman in the back that this person didn't see, and she said, I'm here. But I mean, it's so typical. It's so typical of the church and our life together. And the bishop challenged us who were sitting there, and it's a challenge for us who are sitting here. He said, you know what, in 30 years, most of us are not going to be alive. And who's going to have the church then? You see, that's the very question that is facing us today. And it just happened yesterday at that meeting. You see, so this posture of ministry, of reaching out to the community, this posture of hospitality that welcomes people of all colors and all ages, and doesn't see that as a negative thing, but a good thing that will give us health and life and vitality for the future. We have to have that posture. You see, and then this posture of generosity, that's what Jesus is all about. It's a posture of generosity. He just opens his arms to all people and welcomes them in and works with them to help them follow him and follow his way. You see. So, that next slide, Hebrews 13 kind of summarizes. Let's read this together. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name, and do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. You see, sacrifice is about praise, it's about worship, it's about doing good, it's about sharing with others. This is just the posture of a Christian. This is the posture of a Christian. So I was thinking about this. Who are the examples? Who are the examples in the New Testament? This is my last point. Okay, go to that next slide. So in Mark chapter 12, you know these stories, right? The poor widow. Remember that? It's only a few words here. So Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. And calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of her wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on." I've discovered that that's a principle that's very true. That the poorer the people are, the more they tend to give, percentage-wise. It's an amazing thing. And I think Jesus was absolutely right here. That we have to recognize that it's not the amount, but it's how generous we are. How generous we are. And that's a posture that we have, generosity. I've talked about that a lot. A second one is Zacchaeus. You all remember the story of Zacchaeus. I mean, these are very familiar stories to us, aren't they? Zacchaeus 19, he was up in the tree. Jesus called him down from the tree and said, "I'm going to have dinner with you." And so he goes to Jesus' house. And Zacchaeus is one of these Pharisees, he's a tax collector, so nobody liked him. He was one of those sinner guys. And here's what happens after Zacchaeus hears Jesus teach. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. I will give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." Is that generous? I think by anyone's standard, that's pretty generous. And Zacchaeus was so touched and moved by Jesus that he took on a posture of giving, a posture of generosity, and just laid it out there and said, "My life has changed. I'm transformed. I'm going to follow Jesus, and this is how I'm going to do it." And then thirdly, you all know the story of the rich young ruler. In Mark chapter 10, he wanted to know what he needed to do to follow Jesus. Jesus said, "Follow the commandments." He said, "I've done all that." And then Jesus says, "Give all that you have to the poor, and then come and follow me." So Jesus is asking for a full commitment, right? 100%, just follow me. And I think Jesus did that because of his heart. He did it because of his posture. His posture was one of keeping and not giving. And so Jesus challenged him to go all the way. And then at the end of the story, Jesus says, "Well, this is the problem, and here's how significant it is that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into heaven." So he's just making it real clear that where our heart is, there our treasure is also. And so the posture of giving, the next slide. There's a couple of principles here. That sacrifice and this posture of sacrifice is worship. It is worship, and it begins with all of us saying to God, "I belong to you." I don't expect all of you to just lay down your lives right now today and say, "I'm 100% for you, God, and whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do." But I think all of us can take steps. We can take steps every day to follow Jesus more closely, can't we? Every single day. And we need to understand that that's worship. Secondly, sacrifice recognizes that God is with us. He's already blessed us and desires for us to walk with him. So God has taken the initiative. He has blessed us. He has a desire for us to walk with him. And when we say yes to God, we're saying, "I know you're with me, God. I know you're with me," and that's going to make life so much better. And then our posture of sacrifice, ministry, hospitality, and generosity is a response to the blessing of God. And we can do that with our time, our talent, our treasure, and our witness as we serve in the kingdom. Okay? Let's pray. Thank God for just the opportunity to consider a posture of giving. And there are many ways in which we do that. And God, I just pray that we would take these words and plant them deep in our hearts, plant them in our minds, as we think about what it is that each of us has to offer to you and to Mount Bethel and to our community at large. And Lord, I pray that we would always have the right understanding that it's not by works that we are saved, but only by grace. But when we receive your grace and when we receive your mercy, when we recognize the bounty of your blessing in our lives, we respond with love